The cruelest goodbye is the one that arrives without a single tear. The great hall of Ashen Hollow Palace shimmered beneath hundreds of silver lanterns, their soft light spilling across polished stone floors where every noble wolf in the Northern Territories stood in breathless anticipation. Moon banners drifted gently from the towering beams overhead while the scent of cedar, winter roses, and fresh pine filled the vast chamber. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Carter, 22 years old, dressed in a simple ivory ceremonial gown that seemed almost too modest among the glittering silks surrounding her. Her hands rested quietly before her, fingers folded together as though she had practiced this moment 1,000 times inside her heart. Across from her, seated upon the ancient moon throne carved from white granite centuries earlier, Alpha King Lucian Ashcroft watched the ceremony with the calm confidence everyone expected from the most powerful alpha alive. His silver eyes never betrayed uncertainty. His posture never revealed hesitation. Every elder believed tonight would strengthen the kingdom. Every noble family believed history would remember this evening. No one expected silence to become the loudest voice in the room. Elder Miriam stepped forward, her weathered hands lifting the moon scroll. Her steady voice echoed through the palace. By the blessing of the moon goddess, two souls stand before destiny. Hundreds of eyes settled upon Evelyn. Some carried sympathy. Others barely concealed amusement. They already knew the whispers. The Alpha King had delayed this ceremony for months. Powerful daughters from the greatest houses had crossed entire kingdoms hoping to earn his favor. Evelyn had never belonged among them. She was an Omega raised in a quiet village beyond Frost Creek, known more for tending injured wolves and comforting frightened children than for politics or ambition. Many wondered why she had even been invited. Lucian rose from the throne with measured grace, his black ceremonial coat falling perfectly across broad shoulders. He descended the marble steps without hurry until only a few feet separated them. The entire hall seemed to stop breathing. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Lucian's voice was deep, controlled, impossible to misunderstand. Evelyn Carter. She lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no accusation within them, no pleading, only quiet attention. I cannot accept the bond placed before us. A ripple swept through the crowd. Several nobles exchanged knowing smiles. Someone quietly whispered, I knew it. Another shook her head with theatrical pity. Lucian continued, every word formal enough to satisfy ancient law. I reject this mating bond and release us both from obligation. Silence crashed over the palace. It was the kind of silence that waited for heartbreak to reveal itself. Every face turned toward Evelyn. They expected trembling hands. They expected tears glistening beneath lantern light. They expected desperate words begging the king to reconsider. Instead, she lowered her gaze for only a heartbeat before lifting it once more. Her lips formed the smallest, gentlest smile, not joyful, not bitter, simply peaceful. I accept your decision, Your Majesty, she said softly. Her voice never cracked. Her breathing never faltered. She placed one graceful hand over her heart in respectful farewell, turned with quiet dignity, and walked toward the enormous palace doors without once looking back. Her footsteps echoed lightly against the marble until they disappeared beyond the golden entrance. No sobs followed her. No accusations lingered in the air. Only absence. Lucian remained standing exactly where she had left him. For reasons he could not explain, victory felt strangely hollow. Around him the nobles resumed whispering, relieved laughter slowly returning as musicians cautiously prepared to play once again. The ceremony had ended exactly as many had predicted. So why did the room suddenly feel colder? Why did the throne behind him seem farther away than it had only moments before? And why, among hundreds of voices celebrating his freedom, could he hear nothing except the quiet sound of a woman walking away without asking him to stay? The celebration inside Ashen Hollow Palace lasted long after the moon ceremony ended, yet Alpha King Lucian Ashcroft found himself hearing very little of it. Crystal glasses clinked together, musicians filled the grand hall with cheerful melodies, and noble families congratulated one another as though the kingdom itself had escaped some terrible disaster. They praised his wisdom. They praised his discipline. They praised the strength it had taken to reject a bond that did not suit the crown. Lucian answered every compliment with the composed smile expected of a king, but each conversation faded almost as quickly as it began. His attention drifted again and again toward the massive palace doors where Evelyn Carter had quietly disappeared. No servant had chased after her. No elder had asked her to remain. She had simply vanished into the cold evening as though she had never belonged there at all. Hours later, when the palace corridors finally grew quiet, Lucian dismissed his attendants and walked alone toward the western balcony overlooking the valley below. Snow had begun falling in slow, graceful flakes, covering rooftops and pine trees in silver. The kingdom looked peaceful from above, exactly as a prosperous realm should. Yet something within him felt strangely unsettled. He told himself it was merely exhaustion. Ceremonies were long. Decisions carried weight. Tomorrow would return everything to normal. That was what logic insisted. The following morning, however, an unexpected report arrived on his desk. Evelyn Carter had officially surrendered her residence within the royal district before sunrise. She had declined every financial gift traditionally offered after a rejected bond. She had refused a carriage from the palace. She had signed the departure ledger with neat handwriting, thanked the clerk for his kindness, and quietly walked through the northern gate, carrying only one travel bag over her shoulder. Lucian stared at the parchment longer than necessary. Most rejected mates remained nearby for weeks, hoping circumstances might change, or at least wishing to preserve their place within court society. Evelyn had done neither. She had left before dawn as though she had already accepted a future without him long before the ceremony ever began. That afternoon, Lady Beatrice Holloway, one of the kingdom's most influential noblewomen, visited the palace with her daughter, elegantly dressed and eager to discuss possible alliances. Her laughter echoed through the audience chamber while servants poured tea into delicate porcelain cups. She spoke confidently about strengthening royal bloodlines, expanding influence, and hosting another ceremony before the next full moon. Lucian listened politely, but when she paused for his opinion, he realized he had not heard half of what she had said. His eyes had wandered toward an empty chair near the tall windows. Just days earlier, Evelyn had quietly waited there during council meetings, bringing fresh documents to elderly advisors before anyone asked. She had always remembered who preferred warm tea instead of coffee. She had noticed when exhausted guards skipped meals and quietly sent bread to the front gate without asking for recognition. No one had thanked her because no one had truly noticed she was doing those things. By evening, Lucian found himself walking through the palace gardens where winter roses struggled against the cold. Near the stone fountain, he encountered old gardener Thomas, who bowed respectfully before returning to his work. The flowers seemed different, Lucian said without thinking. Thomas smiled sadly while trimming a frozen branch. Miss Carter always covered the roots before the first snow, Your Majesty. She said even the strongest flowers deserved kindness when winter arrived. Lucian looked down at the uncovered rose bushes, their leaves touched by frost. A strange weight settled across his chest. It was not guilt. At least that was what he insisted to himself. It was only an unfamiliar emptiness, as though someone had quietly removed a small light from the palace without anyone noticing until darkness had already begun to spread. Winter slowly surrendered to early spring by the time Evelyn Carter reached the quiet border town of Pine Creek, a peaceful settlement tucked between rolling hills and towering evergreens nearly 200 miles north of Ashen Hollow Palace. There were no grand stone walls protecting the village, no royal banners dancing in the wind, and no nobles measuring another person's worth by family name or social standing. Life moved at a gentler pace here. Children laughed while chasing one another along wooden fences. Farmers greeted strangers with warm smiles. Merchants remembered every familiar face. Evelyn rented a tiny cottage beside the town's old healing house, its white porch wrapped with climbing ivy that had somehow survived the cold season. The owner, an elderly widow named Margaret Ellis, welcomed her with fresh bread, warm soup, and a simple promise. Around here, people earn respect by how they treat others. Those words settled quietly inside Evelyn's heart. Every morning before sunrise, she opened the doors of the healing house and greeted anyone who needed comfort. Some arrived with tired muscles after long days working the fields. Others brought frightened children suffering from winter fevers or lonely elders who simply needed someone willing to listen. Evelyn never hurried anyone. She remembered names after meeting them only once. She offered encouragement as naturally as breathing, and somehow every room felt calmer after she entered it. Soon, even injured wolves wandering near the forests began appearing outside her porch. They seemed strangely drawn toward the gentle scent of lavender and cedar that always lingered around her. She carefully cleaned scratched paws, wrapped small injuries with fresh linen, and released them back into the woods with quiet smiles. The townspeople noticed something remarkable. Wild animals that usually feared humans stood peacefully beside her as though they understood they were safe. Children started calling her the Lady of the Pines because every creature seemed less afraid whenever she was near. Evelyn only laughed softly whenever she heard the nickname. She insisted kindness was not magic. It was simply a choice anyone could make. One bright Saturday morning, the annual spring market filled the town square with colorful booths, handmade quilts, fresh apples, honey jars, and cheerful music drifting through the crisp air. While helping arrange flowers outside the healing house, Evelyn noticed a frightened little boy standing alone beside the fountain, tears quietly rolling down his cheeks. Without asking questions, she knelt beside him until her eyes were level with his. "Would you like me to help you find someone?" she asked gently. The boy nodded. Together they searched every corner of the busy square until an anxious mother came running through the crowd, wrapping her son in a grateful embrace. She thanked Evelyn again and again, but Evelyn simply smiled and said, "He was brave. I only walked beside him." Nearby merchants witnessed everything. They began sharing the story with travelers passing through Pine Creek. Weeks became months, and more visitors arrived asking for the kind healer everyone seemed to be talking about. Some traveled 30 miles. Others came from neighboring territories after hearing stories carried from town to town. None spoke about her beauty or her past. They spoke about how peaceful they felt after spending only a few minutes in her presence. Meanwhile, far beyond the quiet hills of Pine Creek, reports slowly reached Ashen Hollow Palace. Royal couriers mentioned a healer whose compassion united strangers. Merchants described an Omega who never asked for payment from families who could not afford it. Guards returning from patrol smiled, while recalling the little cottage where exhausted travelers always found warm tea waiting on the porch. Each report was brief. Each sounded ordinary by itself. Yet together, they painted the picture of someone who seemed to shine brighter the farther she moved from the palace that had once failed to see her worth. Without realizing it, Evelyn had stopped searching for the life she believed she had lost. She had quietly begun building one that belonged completely to her. By the time summer painted the northern forests in deep shades of emerald, stories from Pine Creek had begun traveling farther than anyone expected. Merchants carried them across busy trade roads. Travelers repeated them beside campfires. Royal patrols mentioned them during routine reports without realizing they were speaking about the same woman. At first, Alpha King Lucian Ashcroft barely noticed. His council meetings were filled with border agreements, harvest forecasts, and disputes between neighboring packs. The kingdom demanded constant attention, and he had learned long ago to separate personal thoughts from royal duty. Yet one quiet afternoon, while reviewing reports inside the council chamber, he paused at a familiar sentence written near the bottom of an otherwise ordinary patrol log. The healer in Pine Creek refused payment again. She said that kindness should never have a price. Lucian read the line twice before setting the parchment aside. Something about those words felt strangely familiar. A few days later, another report arrived. This one came from Captain Nathan Brooks, a veteran commander who rarely included personal observations in official documents. Several injured travelers recovered more quickly after receiving care from the local healer. Morale among border settlements has noticeably improved because of her presence. Lucian leaned back in his chair. "Who is this healer?" he asked. His royal secretary searched through a stack of records before answering. "Her name is Evelyn Carter, Your Majesty." The room became unexpectedly quiet. Even the scratching sound of quills across paper seemed to disappear. Lucian lowered his eyes to the report once again. The name had not changed. Only the woman carrying it had. Later that evening, he attended a diplomatic banquet hosted for visiting elders from the Western Territories. Conversations drifted from trade to festivals, from weather to family traditions. During dessert, an elderly beta named Samuel Hayes smiled warmly as he recalled his recent journey through Pine Creek. "There is a remarkable young healer living there now," he said. I have visited many settlements over the years, but I have never seen someone make strangers feel like family so quickly. Another guest nodded in agreement. She remembers every child's birthday. She leaves baskets of fresh bread outside the homes of widows before sunrise. Last month, she spent 3 days helping rebuild the schoolhouse after a storm damaged the roof. Lucian remained silent, listening. Samuel chuckled softly before adding, "The interesting part is that she never speaks about herself. She only asks how everyone else is doing." Those words lingered long after the banquet ended. That night, unable to sleep, Lucian wandered through the palace library where moonlight spilled across endless shelves filled with ancient histories. His footsteps slowed near a window overlooking the royal gardens. He remembered another evening months earlier when Evelyn had quietly placed a blanket across the shoulders of an elderly scholar who had fallen asleep while reading. She had noticed what everyone else had overlooked. She always had. The next morning, Lucian requested the latest reports from every northern border town. His advisors exchanged puzzled glances but obeyed without question. Nearly every document mentioned the same name. One praised her work with orphan children. Another described how neighboring packs had started cooperating after meeting during volunteer gatherings she organized. One elderly sheriff wrote only a single sentence: "People arrive carrying burdens and leave carrying hope." Lucian folded the papers carefully. He realized something that unsettled him far more than he wished to admit. Since leaving Ashen Hollow Palace, Evelyn had never once sent a message asking for recognition. She had never defended herself against the rumors that followed the rejection ceremony. She had never attempted to remind anyone what she had lost. She had simply lived with quiet purpose, and somehow that quiet had grown louder than every celebration still echoing through his palace walls. Several days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at Ashen Hollow Palace, carrying nothing more than a worn leather satchel and decades of quiet wisdom. Elder Abigail Whitmore had served the royal family since Lucian was a child, retiring only after age finally persuaded her to leave the demanding life of the court. She rarely returned without reason, and when she requested a private audience, Lucian welcomed her with sincere respect. She accepted a cup of tea, smiled gently, and studied the young king with the same patient eyes that had watched him grow into the ruler he had become. "You have been reading reports about Pine Creek," she said softly. Lucian did not deny it. "People speak highly of the healer." "There." Abigail nodded. "They should." She reached into her satchel and carefully removed a small wooden box tied with a faded blue ribbon. Time had softened its edges, but it had clearly been treasured. "She asked me to keep this if she ever left the palace." Lucian accepted the box with quiet curiosity. Inside rested a folded piece of linen embroidered with the royal crest, stitched entirely by hand. Every thread was nearly perfect. Beneath it lay several tiny notes written in elegant handwriting. One listed herbs that eased exhaustion after long council sessions. Another reminded kitchen staff that the king often forgot breakfast whenever meetings began before sunrise. A third simply read, "Please leave warm tea in the library after sunset. His Majesty always stays longer than he realizes." Lucian looked up slowly. "She wrote these." Abigail smiled. "Every one of them." She continued before he could speak again. "Do you remember the winter you caught a terrible fever after inspecting the northern forts?" Lucian nodded faintly. "The physician said I recovered quickly." Abigail's smile carried both kindness and sadness. "Because every night after the physicians left, Evelyn remained outside your chamber preparing fresh herbal remedies. She never crossed the threshold because she believed your privacy mattered. She simply left everything where the servants would find it before sunrise." Lucian lowered his eyes to the handwritten notes. His fingers rested gently against the careful ink as though touching memories he had never known existed. Abigail continued speaking with calm honesty. "Do you remember the heavy cloak delivered before your journey to the eastern mountains 2 years ago?" Lucian remembered praising the royal tailor for its craftsmanship. Abigail shook her head. "The tailor only attached the buttons. Evelyn spent weeks sewing the lining because she learned the mountain winds could become dangerously cold at night. She never wanted recognition. She only hoped you would stay warm." Silence settled between them. Outside the palace windows, a gentle breeze stirred the summer roses. Abigail reached into the box one final time and unfolded a small piece of parchment that had clearly been read many times before. I debated whether to show you this, she admitted. It was written the evening before the moon ceremony. Lucian accepted it carefully. The message contained only one sentence. If happiness chooses another path for him, then I hope he never feels guilty for following it. He read the words again, slower this time. There was no resentment in them. No accusation. No bitterness hidden between the lines. Only a quiet wish for someone else's peace. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, Lucian found himself unable to explain the weight pressing against his heart. It was no longer the uncomfortable emptiness that had followed Evelyn's departure. It was something far more difficult to ignore. He realized that the woman he had believed was waiting for a crown had never wanted the throne at all. She had simply cared for the man sitting upon it, expecting nothing in return. And somehow, without asking for anything, she had left behind a kindness that continued filling rooms she had not entered for months. The following sunrise found Alpha King Lucian Ashcroft standing alone in the royal stables before most of the palace had awakened. Golden lights stretched across the cobblestones while stable hands quietly prepared horses for another ordinary day, unaware that their king had already made an extraordinary decision. He wore no jeweled cloak, no ceremonial crown, and no embroidered cape bearing the royal crest. Instead, he chose a simple, dark traveling coat, sturdy leather boots, and a weathered satchel containing only the essentials for the journey north. When Captain Nathan Brooks approached with a full royal escort ready to accompany him, Lucian shook his head. I will travel with only 2 guards, he said calmly. The kingdom will not fall apart because its king spends a few days on the road. Nathan studied him for a long moment before quietly nodding. By midday they had left the towering walls of Ashen Hollow Palace behind, following winding roads that crossed quiet rivers, rolling meadows, and endless forests glowing beneath the warmth of late summer. Every village welcomed the travelers with respectful bows, but Lucian found himself asking only one question wherever they stopped. Have you heard of Evelyn Carter? Every answer sounded remarkably similar. An elderly baker smiled while wrapping fresh bread. She helped my granddaughter overcome her fear of speaking in public. A blacksmith laughed warmly. She convinced 2 stubborn neighbors to forgive each other after 5 years without a single conversation. A young mother held her sleeping baby a little closer before saying, My son laughs again because of her. No one described titles. No one spoke about destiny or royal ceremonies. They remembered simple acts of kindness that had quietly changed ordinary lives. 3 days later, the travelers reached Pine Creek just before sunset. The peaceful little town looked exactly as the reports had described. Children raced through the square carrying colorful paper kites, while neighbors greeted one another by name from front porches lined with flowers. Laughter drifted through the warm evening air. Lucian expected someone to recognize him immediately, but most people merely smiled politely before returning to their conversations. Here he was not the center of every room. He was simply another traveler passing through. As they walked farther into town, soft laughter echoed from the healing house at the edge of the square. Lucian instinctively slowed his steps. Through the open windows, he saw Evelyn standing beside a long wooden table covered with fresh herbs, glass jars, and neatly folded linen. She looked different than she had inside the palace, not because of her clothing, but because of the light in her expression. She moved through the room with effortless confidence, greeting each visitor with genuine warmth. An elderly man struggled to carry a basket of vegetables, and before he could ask for help, Evelyn lifted it with an easy smile and walked beside him to the door. A little girl proudly handed her a crooked drawing made with colored pencils. Evelyn accepted it as though it were the greatest masterpiece she had ever seen, kneeling to thank the child with complete sincerity. Moments later, she noticed a lonely traveler sitting quietly outside, beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Without hesitation, she carried 2 cups of tea onto the porch and offered one with the same gentle kindness she had once shown every servant inside Ashen Hollow Palace. Watching from across the street, Lucian felt something inside him quietly break apart. This was not the woman who had lost everything. This was the woman who had finally discovered where she truly belonged. For the first time since the moon ceremony, he understood that he had not come to Pine Creek to rescue Evelyn from loneliness. He had come because she was no longer lonely at all, and he was the one still searching for the peace she had already found. The next morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight that filtered gently through the towering pine trees surrounding Pine Creek. Alpha King Lucian Ashcroft stood alone outside the small healing house long before the first visitors appeared. For nearly an hour, he watched the quiet rhythm of Evelyn Carter's new life unfold. She swept the front porch before anyone else was awake. She watered the flowers growing beside the wooden steps. She smiled at every neighbor who passed, greeting each by name as though they had known one another forever. There was no sadness hidden behind those smiles. No lonely glances toward distant mountains. She looked completely at peace. When the morning rush finally slowed, Evelyn stepped outside carrying a basket filled with freshly washed blankets. She nearly reached the clothesline before noticing the familiar figure waiting beneath the old oak tree. For the briefest moment, surprise flickered across her face. Then it disappeared as quietly as it had come. "Your Majesty," she said with calm courtesy. Lucian slowly approached. "You do not have to call me that here." Evelyn offered a small, polite smile. "It is still who you are." A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine needles between them, while birds sang somewhere high above the branches. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Lucian broke the silence. "I came to see you." Evelyn nodded softly. "I imagined you might someday." Her answer carried no bitterness, only quiet acceptance. Lucian searched her face, hoping to find the woman who had once looked at him with silent devotion. But what he found instead was someone stronger, someone who no longer measured her happiness by his presence. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one." Evelyn listened without interrupting. "I believed I was protecting the kingdom," Lucian continued. "I thought I was making the correct decision for everyone. I never stopped to understand what it would cost you." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at him. "It did cost me something," she admitted gently. "Losing the future I imagined was painful." Lucian felt the words settle heavily inside his heart. "Then I was wrong." She gave a small nod. "Yes." There was no anger in her voice. Somehow that made the truth even harder to hear. Lucian took one careful step closer. "I would like the chance to make things right." Evelyn smiled with the same quiet kindness she offered everyone in Pine Creek. "You already have." He looked at her, confused. "I forgave you a long time ago." The answer caught him completely unprepared. "You forgave me?" She nodded. "Holding resentment would only have kept me tied to a life that was already over. Forgiveness allowed me to begin another one." Lucian felt hope rise for the first time since arriving. "Then perhaps there is still a chance for us." Evelyn's expression remained warm, but her answer came without hesitation. "Forgiveness is not the same as returning." The breeze seemed to stop. Even the distant laughter from the town square faded into silence. Lucian stood motionless, absorbing every word. Evelyn rested one hand lightly against the weathered fence beside her. "I do not regret caring about you," she said softly. "But I finally learned something after leaving the palace." She looked toward the little town where neighbors were already waving to her from across the street. Love should never require someone to forget their own worth. Lucian followed her gaze as another child came running toward the healing house, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from a nearby meadow. The little girl happily placed them into Evelyn's hands before running back to her waiting parents. Evelyn laughed with genuine joy, completely unaware that the simple moment revealed everything Lucian had failed to understand. She had not been waiting for someone to choose her anymore. She had already chosen herself, and for the first time in his life, the Alpha King realized that earning her heart would require far more than asking for it back. The days that followed surprised everyone in Pine Creek, especially those who had quietly assumed the Alpha King would leave after hearing Evelyn's answer. Instead, Lucian Ashcroft remained in the little town without making another request and without expecting special treatment. He rented a modest room above the general store, thanked the owner for an ordinary breakfast each morning, and spent his days walking through the community with no royal escort at his side. At first, the townspeople watched him cautiously. They knew who he was, but they also knew that titles meant very little once someone stepped beyond the palace walls. Respect was earned one choice at a time. Lucian seemed to understand that better than anyone expected. When a summer storm damaged part of the old wooden bridge crossing the creek, he arrived before sunrise carrying lumber alongside local carpenters. He listened instead of giving orders. He accepted advice from craftsmen who had spent decades repairing the bridge. By sunset, his hands were covered with sawdust, and for the first time in years no one addressed him as Your Majesty. They simply thanked him by name. A week later, he joined farmers gathering apples from a hillside orchard before an approaching rain could spoil the harvest. He climbed ladders, filled baskets, and laughed quietly when an elderly farmer corrected the way he stacked fruit inside the wagon. Instead of feeling insulted, Lucian smiled and tried again until he got it right. The old farmer patted his shoulder with approval. "Now you are learning." Those simple words stayed with him far longer than any praise he had received inside the royal court. Evelyn noticed everything, although she never commented on it. Occasionally, she saw him carrying supplies for the schoolhouse or helping children repaint weathered fences around the town square. Sometimes he stopped by the healing house to deliver fresh firewood before walking away without waiting for thanks. He no longer searched for opportunities to impress her. He simply helped wherever help was needed. One quiet afternoon, Margaret Ellis smiled as she watched Lucian repairing the loose steps leading to the healing house porch. "You know," she said gently to Evelyn, "most people change because they hope someone will reward them. He looks like someone who is changing because he finally understands himself." Evelyn followed Lucian with her eyes as he carefully tightened another wooden board before checking each step to make sure it was safe. She remained silent, but something thoughtful settled across her expression. As summer slowly gave way to the first cool evenings of early autumn, Pine Creek prepared for its annual harvest festival. Families decorated the streets with lanterns, ribbons, and baskets overflowing with pumpkins, apples, and bright orange flowers. Volunteers worked together every evening to transform the town square into a place where everyone felt welcome. Lucian joined them without being asked. He carried tables, hung lanterns from tall oak branches, and stayed long after sunset helping children finish paper decorations that fluttered gently in the evening breeze. No speeches announced his efforts. No royal scribes recorded them. They became meaningful precisely because no one expected them. On the night before the festival, Evelyn stepped outside the healing house after finishing her final patient of the day. Across the quiet street, she saw Lucian sitting alone on the edge of the newly repaired bridge, watching moonlight shimmer across the peaceful creek. His shoulders no longer carried the rigid confidence of a king determined to control every outcome. They carried something quieter now. Humility, patience, hope without entitlement. For the first time since he had arrived in Pine Creek, Evelyn wondered whether the man sitting beneath the autumn stars was no longer trying to reclaim the life he had lost. Perhaps he was slowly becoming someone entirely new, someone who understood that the greatest strength was not found in being chosen first, but in becoming worthy of trust one quiet act of kindness at a time. The harvest festival arrived beneath a brilliant full moon that bathed Pine Creek in soft silver light, transforming the quiet little town into a place that seemed lifted from a dream. Lanterns swayed gently above every street. Children laughed while chasing glowing fireflies across the square, and neighbors gathered around long wooden tables filled with homemade bread, fresh apples, roasted vegetables, and warm cider. There were no royal ceremonies, no formal announcements, and no ancient laws commanding hearts to obey destiny. There were only ordinary people celebrating another season together. Evelyn Carter walked through the festival with the same quiet smile that had become part of the town itself, stopping often to greet familiar faces and accept warm embraces from families whose lives she had gently touched over the past months. As musicians began playing a slow melody beneath the old oak tree in the center of the square, Mayor Daniel Harper stepped onto the small wooden stage with a grateful smile. "Every harvest festival," he announced, "we recognize someone who reminds us what it truly means to serve others." The crowd applauded politely, expecting the honor to go to one of the longtime residents. Instead, the mayor looked toward Evelyn. This year, Pine Creek wishes to thank the woman who arrived carrying only one travel bag and somehow gave this entire town a place that feels more like home. Thunderous applause echoed across the square. Children cheered. Elderly couples smiled through joyful tears. Evelyn stood completely still, overwhelmed by a recognition she had never sought. She slowly stepped onto the stage, placing one hand over her heart in humble gratitude. Before she could speak, another figure quietly emerged from the crowd. Lucian Ashcroft walked forward wearing the same simple clothes he had worn throughout his stay in Pine Creek. There was no crown upon his head and no royal guard announcing his presence. He stopped a few feet from Evelyn, surrounded by townspeople who had watched his quiet transformation one day at a time. Without hesitation, Lucian lowered himself onto one knee. A gentle hush settled across the festival. No one had expected the Alpha King to kneel before anyone. Lucian lifted his eyes to Evelyn with complete sincerity. "Months ago," he said softly, "I believed that leadership meant choosing what was best for a kingdom. I understand now that true leadership begins with learning to value one heart before seeking to guide thousands." Evelyn looked at him in silence, her eyes reflecting the moonlight above. "I cannot erase the pain I caused," he continued. "I cannot ask you to forget it. But because of you, I have learned that kindness is stronger than pride, that respect is earned through daily choices, and that love cannot be demanded by power or granted by title." He took a slow breath before speaking the words that carried no command, only hope. "I am not asking because destiny once pointed us toward each other. I am asking because I have come to admire the woman you are. Evelyn Carter, if there is ever a place for me beside you, I would spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve it." Tears shimmered in many eyes throughout the crowd, but Evelyn's expression remained calm, thoughtful, and peaceful. She stepped closer until only a single pace separated them. Then, instead of answering immediately, she gently offered her hand. Lucian looked at it for a brief moment before accepting it with quiet gratitude as he rose to his feet. Evelyn smiled, the same gentle smile that had remained unbroken on the day she walked away from the palace. "I cannot return to the woman I was," she said softly. She needed someone else to tell her she was enough. She held his hand a little more firmly. "But the woman standing here today chooses her own future. And today, I choose to discover what tomorrow looks like with the man you have become." At that very moment, a cool breeze drifted through the festival, carrying silver leaves across the square as moonlight seemed to shine just a little brighter over the two of them. No ancient voice declared a bond. No mystical force demanded their hearts become one. The only blessing they needed came from a simple choice freely made by two people who had both grown beyond who they once were. Around them, Pine Creek erupted into joyful applause while children laughed. Lanterns danced gently in the evening breeze, and somewhere high above the quiet town, the full moon silently witnessed a truth greater than destiny itself. Real love is never proven by the moment someone chooses you first. It is revealed when two hearts, stronger and wiser than before, choose each other freely after every reason to walk away. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What was your favorite moment, and what message or lesson did you take away from Evelyn and Lucian's journey? Share your opinion in the comments below and join the conversation with fellow story lovers. If you enjoyed this tale, please give the video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Alpha's Regret Stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next exciting story filled with romance, drama, betrayal, and unforgettable twists. See you in the next story.